Have you ever contemplated replacing the steering wheel on your Logitech G27? If you've ever wondered whether installing a larger wheel is all that it's hyped up to be, today we'll find out. Will the G27 be turned into a precision instrument or a big sloppy mess? Hello everyone and welcome to Let's Test Drive. Today I'll be guiding you through the steps I took to modify my Logitech G27 steering wheel. Finally, I'll end by giving you my thoughts and opinions about using a larger wheel on the G27. So if you're contemplating doing something similar, these are some of the things you must know and should be made aware of. Also, if you're anyway interested in car or racing titles, be sure to check out my review and comparison videos. First thing was ordering all the parts off eBay. I opted for a 340mm Sparco wheel with a 70mm PCD. Next was a G27 adapter. I opted for this one as it allowed me to fit either a 70 or 74mm PCD wheel. A 6-piece set of 12mm momentary on-off buttons was ordered, and then another 6-piece set after I destroyed some buttons when soldering. A set of 20 4-pin mini micro connectors was also needed, as this would allow me to install new buttons without soldering onto the existing PCB or cutting any existing wires. Finally, a large roll of carbon wrap. I opted for the bigger size as I thought it might be handy to learn to wrap any future projects. So my first step was to decide on the button plate design. After spending some time googling images of racing wheels, I did a few rough mock-ups in Photoshop and opted for a layout similar to the wheel used in the Ferrari 458 Challenge. I marked out the design on paper and then cut out a scrap piece of 9mm MDF I had laying around. I had to use a jigsaw to cut the shape out roughly and finish the edges off with a file. It was at this point I had to buy a spade drill set to install the 12mm buttons. I picked the set up for $7 as opposed to the $25 I would have had to spend on a non-spade drill bit. I also had to use a Dremel to route out the back of the plate so the buttons could be screwed in place. In hindsight, this may not have been necessary, as using a glue gun would have been just as effective, although perhaps a little messy. Sealing the MDF for vinyl wrapping was also important to ensure the wrap would adhere to the MDF, so I applied multiple coats of PVA glue and sanded it back for a super smooth finish. For the edges, I used a $1 bottle of nail polish using the same method. My goal here was to ensure the vinyl wrap had a super smooth and non-porous surface to stick to easily. Dismantling the G27 was pretty easy, with a little bit of care needing to be taken when removing the wheel and PCB, as the ribbon cables are quite short. Turning the wheel upside down and resting it on the base while unscrewing the PCB and disconnecting the cables made everything much easier. There are 3 cables needing to be disconnected in total: the main PCB connector and then 2 separate connectors used by the buttons. Now, one of the key factors when doing this mod was to ensure that I wasn't going to be soldering onto the existing PCB or cutting any existing wiring. This is where the 4-pin mini micro connectors come in. They're a perfect fit for the G27 and allowed me to keep the PCB and existing wiring untouched. This would make switching back to the original wheel and button set easy and hassle-free. Here's a wiring diagram showing how the original buttons were connected, and for the new 4-pin mini micro connectors, I had to replicate the wiring connections taking into account the colors of the new wires. When it comes to soldering, I would say I have minimal prior experience, and I ended up melting the terminals of some of the buttons due to holding the soldering iron on them for too long. If you do plan on doing this mod, be sure to buy 2 sets of 6 buttons so you can practice on 1 set. Once I had all the buttons soldered, I installed them onto the button plate and was ready to solder them directly to the 4-pin mini micro connectors. To make this as easy as possible, I opted to remove the paddle shifters so I had clear access when soldering the buttons to the 4-pin mini micro connectors. Removing the paddle shifters also allowed me to modify and extend the paddle shifter's length, but more on that later. A little bit of fiddling was required to ensure all wiring fit under the adapter plate and that none of the wiring would be pinched or damaged. With the button plate and wheel installed, resting the wheel face down onto the table made soldering much easier. Just remember to always slip some shrink wrap onto the wires before soldering them together. Another hurdle I ran into was stripping the thread on one of the plastic buttons. This was easily fixed though with the use of a glue gun, which also came in handy use for my next step. I did spend a bit of time contemplating how to extend the paddle shifters as easily and cheaply as possible without damaging them or having to drill into them or needing to have any special tools. Now, I did consider creating aluminium extensions, however, this would have required a tap and die set, as a tap would have been needed to create new threads for the screws to hold the paddle extensions in place. Not to mention all the filing and cutting that would have been required. Having access to a CNC machine in this case would have made everything much easier. $2 later though, I had two protractors and glue gunned them onto the paddle shifters. These are rock solid and don't budge, and allows me to revert to the original shifters using a bit of elbow grease. The key tip with this was to apply the glue to the plastic protractors first, as applying them to the shifter's cold metal caused the glue to set too fast. So there you have it, everything was almost complete. The final step was to reinstall the paddle shifters and apply a few decals to the buttons. As you can see here, I'm removing the button plate. Turning the wheel upside down makes this process much easier. All up, removing the button plate and reinstalling it would have taken around 10 minutes, and just goes to show how easy this mod makes returning the G27 to its original wheel and button set. This was one of my key prerequisites when doing this mod, as I didn't want to have to solder onto the PCB or cut original wires or connectors. I can literally return my wheel to its original form and nobody would suspect a thing. So after all that work, what are my final thoughts on the performance and feeling of this new wheel? Now, when originally starting this mod, I wasn't expecting any major differences in terms of performance or feel, but what I was initially shocked and disappointed with was how much worse driving felt. I could best describe it as forgetting how to ride a bike and then having to relearn again, which I believe came down to two issues. The first was the reduction of force feedback strength due to the larger diameter wheel. Increasing the diameter of the wheel caused a reduction of required steering effort. This was a huge disappointment for me, as I wish the standard G27 had more power behind it. Now, of course, larger steering wheels have their place. In real cars, a larger steering wheel would reduce the required steering effort, and combined with power steering would make the required effort to turn the steering wheel less, and therefore be perceived by the general driving population as a nicer and easier drive. The next issue I had was how less responsive steering felt, which in effect caused cars to feel sloppy and unresponsive to steering inputs. For any given input, my hands would have to travel a larger circular distance. Steering from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock on the standard G27 would require me to move my hands 44 centimeters. On a 344mm wheel, it's 53 centimeters. Now, that may not seem like much on paper, but in reality, it makes the car feel less responsive and slower in terms of driver input, as moving your hand the shorter distance will always be quicker and in effect make steering feel quicker and the car more responsive. Taking into account the size of other major force feedback steering wheels, it's interesting to note how they're all around the 280 to 300mm mark. In hindsight, going to a 340mm wheel may not have been the best option, and if I was to do this again, I would try to find a steering wheel closer to the size of the original. With all that being said, take this as the opinion of somebody that has had over 700 hours with the standard G27 wheel. Perhaps I'm just too accustomed and used to the original wheel and my setup, and I don't want to rule out increasing your wheel size completely, as it's not hard to find other G27 users with the larger wheel. Perhaps with more effort, practice and hours on the wheel, I would learn to adapt to its larger size. If you're someone that has gone to a large wheel, I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are, and if it took some time and effort to adapt to. The reduction in force feedback strength though is one of my biggest gripes, as it really dampens the sense of small, nuanced forces delivered to your hands. For drifting, I didn't find this too much of an issue, but for racing, it may not be optimal. For now, I'll most likely be returning to my original wheel and perhaps using the wheel I made as a wall clock. Stay tuned for that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to hit the like button, and if you want to see more videos like this from me in the future, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you all again next time.